Chapters in History, Who Conducted the Underground Railroad, and Other Questions About the Path to Freedom. Chapter 1. Did the Underground Railroad really run underground? No, the Underground Railroad didn't run underground. It wasn't even a real railroad. The Underground Railroad was a secret pathway from slavery in the South to freedom in the North. Between 1810 and 1850, over 100,000 African American slaves traveled on the Underground Railroad to northern states and Canada where they could be free. They were helped by many brave people along the way. Life as a slave. Life was very hard for slaves. They did what their owners ordered them to do. They worked from sunrise to sunset. Some worked in fields, some worked in their owners' homes. Slave children began working when they were only 6 years old. No matter what jobs the slaves did, they were not free to live their own lives. Slaves were punished when they did not do what they were ordered to do. Many slaves dreamed about escaping to freedom, but they would need help. Help on the road to freedom. African American slaves fleeing to freedom had people help them along the way. Sometimes it might be another slave who gave the runaway slave food or a place to sleep. Many white people who did not believe in slavery helped too. They gave clothes, food, money, medicine, and shelter to runaway slaves. Many free African Americans helped slaves escape to freedom as well. These helpers showed the runaway slaves the best places to hide. They showed them the best routes heading north. They gave the slaves money to help them escape on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad. People used railroad words to talk about the escaping slaves. Runaway slaves were called passengers, packages, and cargo. The people helping them were known as conductors. Places where runaway slaves could be safe were called stations. The trails the slaves took were called routes. Before long, people called this secret network of slaves and their helpers the Underground Railroad. Fact: another name for a safe resting place was depots. The Underground Railroad gets its name. No one knows who named the Underground Railroad. One story says it happened this way. Slave catchers chased some runaway slaves into Pennsylvania. Suddenly, the escaping slaves disappeared. The slave catchers looked and looked but could not find the runaway slaves anywhere. One puzzled slave catcher said, "There must be an Underground Railroad somewhere." From then on, the Underground Railroad was running. Fact: the first real railroads were being built in America in 1830. Running away to freedom. Slaves had to be brave to run away. Some spent weeks or even months, scared, hungry, and tired in order to be free. But for many slaves, the hardship and danger were worthwhile after they rode to freedom on the secret rails of the Underground Railroad. Fact: a nickname for the Underground Railroad was the Freedom Train. Chapter 2. Who were the passengers on the Underground Railroad? Runaway slaves were called passengers when they escaped to freedom on the Underground Railroad, but there were no tickets to buy seats to ride on. These passengers were following a path to the north. They walked through woods, rode on wagons, slept in barns, and hid on boats. Sometimes slaves on the Underground Railroad were also called packages or cargo. Running away. Running away was a big decision for slaves. Running away meant they were leaving their family and friends behind. They were leaving the slave world they knew for a free world they did not know. Slaves running away had to plan their escape. They could carry only a few belongings. They had to trust people along the way. They had to keep up their courage on the long road to freedom. But the chance for freedom was worth the hardship and danger. Fact: many slaves ran away at Christmas. They knew their owners would be too busy to notice they were gone. Getting on board the Underground Railroad. Most runaway slaves had help from slaves who were not running away. These slaves were the first conductors runaway slaves met on the Underground Railroad. They shared what little food and clothing they had. They shared their knowledge of the safest routes north. They warned the runaway slaves of dangerous people and places. In the free states. Runaway slaves were helped by many African American and white conductors when they reached the free northern states. These conductors gave their passengers food, clothing, money, and medicine. They helped the runaway slaves find jobs and homes. But they still were not safe. Due to slave laws, runaways could be captured at any time and returned to their owners. Canada, land of the free. Many slaves rode on the Underground Railroad to Canada. Slavery was not allowed in Canada. In Canada, runaway slaves did not have to worry about ever being returned to their owners in the United States. Thousands of free African Americans lived in Canada. These former slaves owned their own homes. They farmed their own farms. They ran their own businesses. They worshipped in their own churches, and their children went to school for the very first time. A Great Escape. Ellen and William Craft were married slaves in Georgia. They knew they had a long, difficult journey to reach freedom in the North. Ellen was very light-skinned. She pretended to be a sick young white man going to the North to see a famous doctor. Her husband William pretended to be her slave. Together the Crafts rode the real railroad to freedom. After their daring escape, the Crafts worked hard to raise money so that other slaves could be free too. A real Underground Railroad package. Henry Brown was a slave in Virginia. He decided to ship himself to freedom in a wooden box. A white friend mailed Henry's box shut and shipped him to Philadelphia. Henry rode in trains and wagons for over 24 hours. When Henry's box was opened up, he was a free man. Henry Box Brown often spoke about his ride to freedom, to raise money to help other slaves ride the Underground Railroad. Unknown passengers. There were thousands of passengers on the Underground Railroad whose daring escapes to freedom will never be known. Many runaway slaves did not share their stories. They did not want people to know their escape routes. They did not want people to know who the conductors were. They did not want people to find out who their owners were. Today, we only know parts of the Underground Railroad story. Much of what happened on the Underground Railroad was secret. We will never know everything about the network of people, places, and pathways of the Underground Railroad, but we do know that thousands of slaves rode the Underground Railroad to freedom.